Transformation in Trials. Welcome to Transformation in Trials. This is a podcast exploring all things transformational in clinical trials. Nothing is off limits on the show, and we will have guests from the whole spectrum of the clinical trials community. And we're your hosts, Ivana and Sam. Today, we're very fortunate to have Brian D. Smith with us for this episode. And Brian, the first question that I would like to ask you is, could you tell us a little bit more about your background in the industry?
Okay, well, I'll try not to talk too long about that because my background in the industry is very long and very varied. I started in the industry as a lab chemist standing at the bench in 1978, so that gives you some indication of how old I am. My career in the industry, which has been in both pharma and in medtech, has really been through phases. I started off and spent several years as a R&D chemist. I then spent, I think, about 15 years in commercial roles in marketing and strategy. But for the last 20 or so years, I've been a research academic, which by the nature of that job means that I'm also an author, and I also advise companies on what my research findings mean for their businesses. So I work with a lot of pharmaceutical companies. So almost next year, I think it'll be 45 years that I've been working in the industry. I kind of describe myself now as a researcher practitioner, a little bit like an oncologist or some other kind of medical specialist in a teaching hospital who does research but also puts their hands on patients. Well, I spend most of my time doing research, but I also spend quite a lot of my time working with companies to show them how to apply this knowledge. And I think I've written over 300 publications now, all about pharma and medtech and strategy. And my 8th book, New Drugs at Fair Prices, is released in the autumn. That's my 8th book.
And having read several of your books, I'm very excited to have you here with us, especially because you take this overall zoomed out view on the industry in general. And I find that really fascinating. And a lot of people that work in our space tend to focus on their specific business function within their specific company.
I mean, to say so. Obviously, there's a purpose for those books. I mean, if you want a book that is about, the application of new clinical trial technologies, then you need a book about that. But we also need to see the big picture. So, my work is mostly into working with senior managers who have very good experts working in all of the functional areas, but they need to see the big picture. And I hope that my varied background in both commercial and R&D and then in research allows me to do that. So that's kind of it to say. So thank you.
I'm curious to hear, how have you seen the industry change, both being in the industry for a long time yourself, but also with the research that you've done so far?
Well, I've seen a lot of change, both in my time in the industry, but also looking back further, since I've studied the evolution of the industry since what you would call its birth in the late 1800s. Interesting about evolution, you may have heard this expression before. Evolutionary scientists sometimes talk about this concept of punctuated equilibrium, meaning that evolution doesn't proceed smoothly and evenly. It tends to go in spurts. So you have long periods of relative stability with slow change, interspersed with short periods of intense, fast, rapid change. And in our industry, you see that in the 1890s, you see it in the 1930s, you see it in the 1960s, and you've seen it in the last 10 or 15 years. So you see this burst. Today's shifts, the ones I've seen in my career, are driven primarily by changes in its external environment. So, and including that, I include both the sociological environment and the technological environment. So I've written an interesting article on this, and if your readers want to know more about it rather than ramble on for 3 hours now, I'll gladly make that article available. But to give you an example, for instance, when I started in the industry, it was, we talked about the medicine of organ. It was essentially an Oslerian view of medicine. That is, we talked about liver cancer, for example. Whereas now we know in oncology, we talk about systemic effects and systemic medicine. And when I started in the industry, a valuable drug was one that simply had more clinical efficacy than its predecessor drug. Well, now, of course, valuable means something completely different. The value is health economic value. So those are among 6 great shifts that are shaping the industry. And of course, this burst of evolution in the last 10, 15 years. I could talk about that forever. I mean, this is really the topic of the future of pharma and advanced medicine, 2 of my books. But in a word, what we've seen is speciation. So in 1978, there was a singular pharma business model. It was research-based, it was predominantly focused on Western developed markets, and it was all about small molecules. Now, of course, you have business models based on research, but also based on very low cost. You have other business models that are based on personalized medicine. It's a global industry now, and small molecules are increasingly a relatively small part of the business from an advanced therapy part of it. I sometimes joke that, when I started in the industry as a research chemist, if I'd have said to my boss, but what about the Indian market or the Chinese market? They would have looked at me like I was an idiot. What, Indian, Chinese, pharmaceuticals? Don't be ridiculous. And now, of course, that's where most small molecules are made. And my research now, as I wrote in Darwin's Medicine, looks at no less than 26 business models. So if you've ever seen one of those tree of life diagrams where the original source of life splits and then splits and then splits and then splits until we have all of these, I think there are 8 million species of life on Earth. Well, my work has a similar diagram in which the original pharmaceutical business model splits into 26 different business models. And that's practically important for 2 reasons. First of all, it means that pharmaceutical companies now need to make a deliberate choice about what business model they're going to be. They have to be this or this. And not straddle, not fall. In English, we say fall between 2 stools. Not play about in the middle. And of course, it raises the importance of the capacity to change, the ability of firms to change, and that's a big issue in the industry, of course.
That is indeed a big issue, and based on the guests we've had on the show so far, we always ask them the same question. What is the one thing that they would wish could change in the industry? If they could just wave a magic wand and make one thing change happen, what would that be? And many of our guests reply something along the lines of, we would change the pace of change. We would make pharmaceutical companies more willing to accept change, faster to adapt change, something along those lines. And I think you might be the perfect person to speak a little bit to why is the industry so slow to change?
Yeah, well, there are probably 3 parts to that answer, and some things that the industry can do things about, and some things that we can't. So I guess the first thing to address is the thing we can't do anything about, which is, remember how the industry is part of an ecosystem that includes healthcare provision and government and so on. And when our business models evolve and change, they do so as a co-evolution with how health systems change and how governments change and how regulation changes, for example. So one of the reasons that we're relatively slow to change is because we're having to do it in sync with those other things. So in biology, you have for instance, you have hummingbirds with very long tongues that can reach to the bottom of flowers to get the nectar out. Well, it would be no good at all if the flower had become very long before the hummingbird had got a long tongue. You need the 2 to, one gets a little longer, then the other one gets a little longer. And so co-evolution is part of the reason, and there's not much we can do about that. But concentrating on what we can think about as an industry, there are 2 things that emerge from my research about change in the industry that I think are important, but which are generally neglected or misunderstood by leaders in the industry. One is a concept from evolutionary biology called the fitness trough. So let me explain what I mean by that. When a species changes from or evolves from one phenotype to another phenotype, it doesn't do so instantly. Our ancestors weren't, apes one day and then humans the next day. They change over time, and there were intermediate stages. And the problem is that those intermediate stages, in order for evolution to work, those intermediate stages have to survive. So, your ancestor, my ancestor, would have been extremely well adapted to the jungle. And then later on, our ancestors were well adapted to the savanna. But in between, you would have had a hybrid form, a missing link, if you like, between humans and hominid ancestors that was not well adapted to the jungle or the savanna. So you need to think, in changing our business models, you need to think about those intermediate stages so that you can keep your business model alive whilst you're making the transition. And that's quite often what causes the problem in the changing of business models, because we don't want to change because it makes us less well adapted to the old environment, which still exists partly, and we're not getting the benefits out of adapting to the new environment, which doesn't yet exist. So that evolutionary scientists plot this on a graph and call it a fitness trough, because your fitness, that is your evolutionary fitness, or in business we call it your competitiveness. As you make the transition, if you're not careful, your competitiveness can decline from one peak to as you're heading to another peak, and you have to manage that transition so you can keep you can survive as you make the transition. So that's one thing about the fitness trough. The other one that I'm doing a lot of work on with companies at the moment is this idea of the micro foundations of change. So if you think about changing a business model, that involves several changes. It involves changes in structure and strategy, but a large part of it is that you're changing your capabilities. And an organization, any complex organization, particularly a pharmaceutical company, has a whole raft of capabilities, thousands and thousands of capabilities. And in my work, I draw the analogy with in the same way that your body or my body has tens of thousands of proteins which do the work, and we call it your proteome. Well, in my work, I look at an organization and its capabiliome, its complete set of capabilities. Now, if you want to change your capabilities, then you have to think, where do those capabilities come from? And again, to use my biological metaphor, where do those, if you wanted to change your proteome, if you wanted to express a new protein in your body, you would have to go tweak the base pair sequence in your DNA, right? That's where it comes from. Now, the equivalent in a business model are what are called micro foundations. So there are things in an organization that lead to capabilities, called them the micro foundations of capabilities. So there are 4 of them. They're the attributes of the people, their knowledge, their skills, their motivations, the team structures that we have, the group processes that we have, that the processes go on within groups, and the conflict resolution methods, that is the way that we resolve conflict and key in alignment between different parts of the organization. So attributes, team structures, group processes, conflict resolution. If your listeners are smart, and I'm sure they are, they'll have realized that the initials for that are ATGC, just like your base pair sequence. So what firms don't do, or that they should do more of, or what good firms do that weaker firms aren't doing, is they drill down and say, okay, well, if we want this new business model, then how will our capability need to change? If we want these new capabilities, change our capability, what micro foundations will we need to change? It's a little bit, if I can stretch that metaphor a little bit further, it's when I'm teaching this, I sometimes say, imagine that you had a chimpanzee and you wanted him to be a business school professor. And some of my students sit there and think, well, that's not a very big transition. But imagine if you wanted to change, then no amount of training the chimpanzee would make him able to be a business school professor, because they simply don't have the FOXP2 gene to allow them to talk. They don't have the developed frontal cerebral cortex and so on. And if you wanted to change that chimpanzee, or his descendants, you'd need to modify his DNA. You needed to modify his proteome, and to do that, you need to modify his DNA. Exactly the same in an organization. If you have an organization which is one business model and you want to adapt it to another one, you need to think, okay, so how will our capability need to change? And if our capability needs to change in that way, how will we need to change those microfoundations, the A, T, G, C microfoundations? And in my experience, many companies, but particularly pharmaceutical companies, don't pay much attention to this. They don't pay enough attention to what will have to change inside the organization to allow us to change. And in the words of one of my clients who introduced me at the workshop I was running, he said, the problem is that we all want change, but none of us wants to change. And I thought that was quite a profound way of putting it. So, you asked the question, why is the industry so slow to change? 3 reasons. One is it's a co-evolutionary problem. We can only change as fast as our partners. The other is that we have to allow for the fitness trough, so we need to think about the intermediate stages of development. And the third, and perhaps the most fundamental, is we need to think about how the business model is reflected in the capabilities, is reflected in the microfoundations. And frankly, if you don't understand those, then your chances of changing successfully are very, very small.
This also reminds me of the conversation we had preparing for this recording about the tools that we try to apply in the pharmaceutical industry are very much from the complicated domain. We assume if we find enough people who are smart, who have done things before, if we just put them in the same room, they'll be able to figure out very complex problems out on their own. Yeah, well, and that's frankly naive.
Obviously, smart people are necessary, but they're not sufficient. Getting them to work together is necessary, but it's not sufficient. It's a little bit, to draw a metaphor from my science background, chemistry is a lot more about just putting the same molecules in the same test tube and seeing what happens. If you want the reaction you want to happen, if you want it to happen at the rate you want it to happen, to produce the products that you want to happen and not some byproducts, then you need to manage the reaction. I remember that vividly as a young chemist, my boss, who was a brilliant PhD chemist, saying, we want to put these two things together and produce this, but not this. So the ortho, but not the meta variant, for example, in organic synthesis. And I said, well, how do you do that? He said, I'll show you. And he explained but he could only do that because he understood the fundamental science underneath about the kinetics of the reaction and nucleophilic substitution or whatever it was at the time. And in the same way, I think leaders in our industry can only really effectively implement change if they understand the science beneath it.
And maybe going back to something you said about how the industry has changed so far, and there are these competing business models now compared to one dominant model earlier. As you see, if you could look into the future, given what you know now, do you see a consolidation of these models, or will they keep branching out into more and more diverse models?
No, I think there will be more speciation of business models, but there will be consolidation in the sense of some, just like with species. So, we now have, hominids, for instance. Okay, so humans have become much, much more specialized and speciated, but there is only one dominant hominid species now. Right? That's us, Homo sapiens sapiens. So I think in each of the 26 business models, and there may be more in the future, you will have one or two or three, a small number of companies that are really good at that. And the others will go by the wayside. And you can see that happening now. I won't embarrass any particular companies, but when I was first researching Darwin's medicine, I remember talking to one very large pharmaceutical company and asking about their business model and discussing this idea that they were trying to be both research-based and Kostler, that is a generic company, at the same time. And they said, yeah, that's what we're going to do. We can do both at once. And I remember thinking, well, I remember as a research scientist, your instinct is go, that runs counter to my findings. How is all my findings wrong? And that company, that shall remain nameless, is now really, really struggling because they're trying to ride two horses. My German friends say you can't dance at two weddings, and it's that one of the things that fascinates me, that idea of trying to do two things at once and failing at both. Almost every culture has an idiom, an expression that describes it. So, in English, we say you can't have your cake and eat it too. The French, I think, say you can't have the butter and the money for the butter. And I think my Italian friends say you can't have a full bottle and a drunk wife.
In Danish, we say you can't have flour in your mouth while you exhale.
Yeah. I'll tell you can't do two things at the same time. Right. So I think we will get more speciation, and I think what the firms that will succeed are the ones that will make decisions about which business model they want to be, and then affect the change by paying attention to both the transitional states, the fitness troughs, and the micro foundations. Just a point of clarity there. Quite often when I talk to companies, they equate business model and firm, like a firm is a business model. And that's true for small companies, or even for medium-sized companies that specialize, like, since I'm talking to a D, and if I look at somebody like Leo, or arguably Novo Nordisk, then, they are concentrating on one business model. But very large companies, the Pfizers of the world, have multiple business models within the same house. And that's okay if you put sort of Chinese walls in between them, or like Novartis has done with Novartis and Sandoz. But increasingly, you have to make them work, you need the business models to be separated in some way, which is why in many pharmaceutical companies, you've seen them split up into multiple businesses, like you remember when Baxter went to Baxter, Baxalta, and Abbott went to AbbVie and Abbott, and even things like Novartis split off Novartis Oncology, although they've reversed that now. These split ups in structure are ways to build Chinese walls between different business models within the same firm.
And did your research find a dominant business model, Brian, or is it quite evenly split amongst the organizations that you looked into? You will have dominant business models in certain environments. And in my work, there's I identify 9 habitats, and those 26 business models sort of occupy evolutionary niches, as it were, within each of those 9 habitats. But it would be to ask, which is the dominant business model, is to imply that there is that they are somehow all competing against each other. They're not. They're occupying separate evolutionary habitats, extracting value in different ways, and they are essentially not competing with each other. Just like, if I take you to the Amazon rainforest, I can show you a jaguar, I can show you a sloth, and I can show you a piranha. Now, they're all very successful species in the same habitat, but they've found different parts of the habitat to occupy and to, if you like, deconflict themselves. But what you don't find is 15 different species of sloth, because they've evolved to find there is one way to be a sloth, and there's one way to be a piranha, and there's one way to be a jaguar. It's about deciding what you be. Of course, the big difference between evolutionary biology and what we do is that, and here's an interesting piece of research for you. Evolutionary biology, of course, is driven by random variation of DNA, by shuffling of the genes. Okay, so what variation we get that might be selected for by the environment is random. It's by chance. the variation in things like strategy and structure and business models that you get in the pharmaceutical industry is, in theory at least, indicate not random. It's driven by the intelligent, thoughtful decisions of very educated people. So you would have thought, wouldn't you, that evolution in the pharmaceutical industry, or in industry generally, would be more efficient, more driven, more rational than in biology, which is a randomly driven process. And there was one researcher, her first name was Hannah, I can't remember her surname now. One researcher did a really interesting piece of research where she looked at the extinction rates of species over geological time, and she looked at the extinction rates of business models over about 200-300 years. Because her hypothesis was that since business models are driven by deliberate change and biological species are driven by random change, you would expect to see business models last much longer, be much more survivable than evolutionary business models. And she found that, in fact, they were virtually the same. And what I remember most about her paper is it said at the end, regarding changes in evolutionary business models, she said, it is as if managers act at random. Now, that's an interesting thought, isn't it? That with all this, all this clever thought we put into our strategy and business models, what a lot of managers do, and it's no better, they're acting at random. That's not the same as saying that all business leaders act at random or are somehow incapable of managing change, but a lot of them are, because, referring back to my earlier comment, because they're not paying attention to the, if you like, the signs underneath the change.
I can relate to that, and also a general lack of commitment to making a choice. When you are picking your strategy, you do have to make choices and then stop doing certain things and do the thing that you picked to do.
That's always one of my questions when I'm talking to business leaders. They'll tell me what their strategy is, and I'll say, so tell me what you're not going to do. And they can talk for hours without taking a breath about what they're going to do. But when you ask them what they're going to stop doing or where they're going to withdraw resources from, you get and then, well, I hadn't thought of it that way, But of course, that's the essence of strategy: is as much what you don't do as what you do.
Yeah, and often I've seen the word strategy used as something important instead of being an actual strategy.
Yeah, I joke with my students when I teach marketing strategy at Coney University. I tell them that this course, marketing strategy, is about the second and third most misused words in the English language. Marketing is a misused word, strategy is a misused word. And of course, they always say, well, what is the most misused word? And I say, well, that's love.
That's true.
And everyone misuses that.
You must also encounter other misconceptions about our industry. Could you tell me more about what you frequently encounter?
Well, there are two sets of misconceptions. The one that I find most often in the industry is what I call it the build it and they will come misconception. That if we just invent a better drug, I better by the standards of regulatory approval, technical and regulatory success, then that's what will succeed. And our industry is dotted with examples of products that were perfectly good, were good products, but have not succeeded commercially. So the misconception that it's about the product is one. It's about the customer. And it used to be that when we said customer, we meant patient, but increasingly we mean patient and prescriber and payer, of course. So that product-led misconception is the one in the industry. When I speak to people outside of the industry, the most irritating misconception right there is this dichotomy between what the industry is for. Is the industry for doing good in society and curing illness and improving and saving and extending human lives? Is it patient-centric, or is it there to create risk-adjusted return on investment for shareholders? And some people think the industry is full of nasty, evil people whose sole job is to extract money on behalf of shareholders and to exploit the sick. Other people think it's all, our job is just to cure illness. And of course, both of those views are naive. Any firm can do good for the patient. Any firm can make money and create return on investment. But the nature of our industry is that, and most industries, is that you have to do both at once. A firm that did not contribute to human health would not make much money and would not last very long, even if it made short-term profits. And a firm that made great profits, at the expense of ignoring the patient wouldn't last very long. You've got to do both at once, and that's the dilemma at most life. It's like that thing you do when you're a kid, isn't it? When you have to pat your head and rub your tummy at the same time, and you've got to do both of those things. And that's what makes it difficult.
Well, Brian, I wonder if you were to pick one thing you would change in our industry, if you could wave a magic wand and suddenly something would change, what would you pick?
Well, I'm laughing at the metaphor of a magic wand because here in the UK, I live just down the road from Harry Potter world. So I know where to get a magic wand if I need one. I think the biggest single thing would be the industry's culture as to what knowledge it regards as valuable. So let me expand on that. It's very obvious, and you won't find anybody in our industry who does not think that science is important. And when they say science, they mean, biology and genetics and chemistry and the natural physical sciences. And the most obvious indicator of that, of course, is if you go into if you go into a pharmaceutical company and say, tell me what qualifications you have, you will find loads and, a huge preponderance of science qualifications. And I'm not saying that they aren't important, they are important. And if I did this game recently with a client and I said to the R&D director, so tell me, how many of your senior people have PhDs in science? And they all went, well, all of them, you fool. I mean, they don't get through the door unless they have a PhD in science. Okay. So I then turned to the commercial director and said, so how many of your guys have PhDs in management or strategy? And he looked at me like, well, none of them. We don't, that's not important to us. So there is a culture within the industry that we need to be good at science in the sense of chemistry, biology, physics, the life sciences. But that the management or organizational science knowledge, well, you can just make that up as you go along. You can just learn that on the job. Now, imagine if I said to the R&D director, well, we'll just bring somebody in who has a degree in a different subject, and we'll teach them genomics. He'll pick that up as he goes along. Then the R&D director would laugh at me, right? Now, I know a lot of managers in the pharmaceutical industry now have MBAs, but first of all, there's still far of the preponderance of people with science backgrounds. But also, even an MBA, as good as an MBA is a broad, is a thin and wide education. It teaches you a little bit about everything in business. And that's not what we would do with our scientists. So, we don't say, well, you've got a master's degree in natural sciences, you can work, no, if you want to work in pharmacokinetics, we expect you to have a PhD in pharmacokinetics or whatever it is. And I think similarly, why is it acceptable that in our industry that you don't necessarily need to have a deep education in the subject? I was at a meeting recently with a company, and they had employed a very large consultancy who I won't name, but you will all know that, and they had employed me to sort of like quality control check what the big consultancy had done for them on strategy, and frankly they hadn't done a very good job, and I politely found a way of saying that their knowledge of strategy was weak. And I was a bit confused, So there's the woman who'd led the project, and she she had a PhD, but she never heard of Henry Mintzberg. Now, forgive me if you don't know who Henry Mintzberg is, but in strategy circles, he's very, very prominent. So a strategy consultant who had not heard of Henry Mintzberg, and I'm going, well, that's a bit strange. And it turned out her PhD was in genetics. And she's a very bright woman, very competent, very capable. But as I came home on the plane, I remember thinking, you would never employ a R&D consultant who didn't have a PhD in science, but you would employ a strategy consultant that doesn't have a PhD in strategy. That's an indication of how our industry's culture values one type of knowledge over another. Now, there's a good reason for that, because historically it was the scientific knowledge allowed you to to succeed. But increasingly in this change world that I talked about earlier, where it is health economic value that matters, then you need to understand both strategy and the science. It's no longer sufficient to understand just the one. So that's the one thing I would change. I would make management science as important to the industry as the natural sciences currently are. Not more important, but as important.
I completely agree. Being a behavioral economist myself,
yeah.
We are also a science. We may be a dismal science, but we're also a science.
Well, that's a concept. But you must say about that. You see, in the hard sciences, the physical sciences, you would never get people making simple, naive statements about the chemistry, because they're all really well-trained chemists, for example. But I say all the time, people saying things about, well, we'll just tell these people to do this and they will do it. And a behavioral economist would go, no, that's not how the world works. It's just this. The science is naive. I joke that if I go in the R&D department and I say, I don't know, define a molecule and differentiate a molecule from an ion on an atom, I could ask 100 scientists and I would get one answer, and it would all be the same answer. But if I went into the commercial department and said, define strategy and tell me the difference between strategy and tactics, I would get 100 answers and they would all be different. Now, it's difficult to be excellent at something if you don't have a common language and an agreed vocabulary. So that's one of the things I would change, the cultural salience of management knowledge.
Well, Brian, as we round off, could you maybe tell us a little bit more about your upcoming book?
Yeah, well, I'm really excited about that. This is book number 8. My wife jokes that writing books is the nearest I'll ever come to having a baby, because she's, when a woman has a baby, she quite often says, no, I'm not going to go through that again. I'll never do that again. And then a little while later, she's thinking, well, maybe another baby, and I have the equivalent thing with books. So this is number 8. After writing the last one, Brand Therapy, I thought, that's enough, I think. But now I wanted to write this one. So this one's called New Drugs, Fair Prices. And it's, as the name suggests, it's about pharmaceutical innovation and the economics of it. Its subtitle is How We Can Manage the Pharmaceutical Innovation Ecosystem to Have Sustainable, Affordable New Medicines. It's inspired by the debate in all countries, but especially in the US, about the control of drug pricing. And as I'm sure you're aware, there's a very heated but not very productive debate about, on the one side, people saying we should control drug prices. And on the other hand, people say we need high drug prices to fund innovation. So it's a very either or, you have innovation or you have low prices. Which do you want? And I think that's the wrong question. The question should be, what can we do to achieve both innovation and affordability at the same time? And the premise of the book is that pharmaceutical innovation, that is what drugs we get and how much they cost, are emergent properties of this complex adaptive ecosystem that we call the pharmaceutical innovation ecosystem. And so just like a garden or an orchard or a rainforest, and if what you want to get out of that ecosystem are drugs that are both innovative and effective and affordable, then it is naive to think you can just do one thing like price control or free pricing. You need to manage the ecosystem holistically. It's a little bit like, you remember, we used to think if you wanted to increase the productivity of an orchard, we would just spray it with DDT. Well, that didn't work too well, right? So you need to manage the whole system. So what the book is about is it looks at the whole ecosystem, 7 habitats within that ecosystem, that the discovery habitat, innovation, the coalition habitat, the value habitat, the pricing habitat, competition habitat, patient habitat, and how they contribute to the whole ecosystem, what they need to contribute to in order for us to get affordable innovation, how they're currently failing, and what we can do to manage the whole system holistically so that we get affordable, innovative drugs. It was a huge project. It obviously, like all my research, it builds on hundreds and hundreds of prior pieces of research by other people. But then I went out and I interviewed almost 80 industry experts, patient groups, R&D experts, health economic experts, intellectual property experts in the industry. I interviewed 80 different people. I wrote up what they said. I sent it back to them. I asked them to critique it. I drew preliminary conclusions. I sent it back to them, said, have I got this right? Have I got it wrong? What's a method's called a Delphi group method, where you get continuous feedback in the group. So it's been a huge project, but I'm very, very happy with how it's turned out. And that comes out in the autumn, or the fall, as my Americans keep calling it. Yeah.
Well, I'm looking forward to reading that. In the meantime, where can our listeners find you if they want to get in touch?
Well, they can find me on LinkedIn as Professor Brian D. Smith. They can find me on Twitter as @Prof Brian D. Smith. They can find me at www.pragmedic.com, pragmedic.com. Or they find me on Google, particularly if they use the D in the middle of my name. If you just plug in Brian Smith, you'll find a saxophone player from New Zealand, which is ironic, really, or funny, because I play the saxophone a little bit myself, but he's much better than I am.
Well, Brian, it's been such a pleasure having you with us today. Thank you so much for joining the call.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure. I look forward to hearing the end result.
You're listening to Transformation in Trials. If you have suggestions for a guest for our show, write to hosts@transformationintrials.com. You can find more episodes in Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and the show notes are available at transformationintrials.buzzsprout.com. Thank you for listening.